93%. That is roughly how consistently one side of your face differs from the other, according to researchers who have measured human faces down to the millimeter. Nobody sees it walking past you. But a camera does, and lately, so does everyone staring at their own front-facing lens for hours at a stretch. Thousands of miles away on a cold Scottish hillside, something else gets measured the same way every single autumn. Not by a camera, by combat. A structure grows out of its skull each year, and by the time the season ends, that structure has either won something or cost something. No filter involved. Stay with this and you will find out exactly what that animal's biology actually proves about symmetry, what it does not prove, and why the internet borrowed a scientific idea it never fully earned. Most people believe something simple about their own face. They believe symmetry is a kind of biological report card. Matching sides even features a nose that lines up with the center of the chin, and the quiet assumption that this person underneath it all is healthier, stronger, better built than someone whose face is less even. That belief did not appear out of nowhere. For decades, some researchers argued that facial symmetry reflected something called developmental stability, the idea that a body which grew without random errors on either side must have handled stress and disease better than a body that grew unevenly. The science tells a far messier story than that. Facial symmetry does change how attractive a face looks under laboratory conditions. That part holds up. But when researchers ask a harder question, whether that same symmetry predicts real measurable health, the answer weakens fast. In one influential study, researchers measured facial asymmetry in 17-year-olds, then measured their actual physical health using clinical data. The asymmetry tracked closely with how healthy people looked to strangers rating their photographs. It did not track with how healthy those people actually were. A more recent scoping review pushed the question further, and its conclusion was blunt. Current evidence does not support the human face as a reliable biomarker of health at all, not in the confident way appearance culture likes to claim. Even large three-dimensional facial scans, far more precise than anything the human eye can detect, failed to turn up a strong link between facial symmetry and other traits it supposedly signals, including basic markers of masculinity researchers expected it to track. There is a stranger twist buried in the older research. In classic experiments from the 1990s, scientists digitally forced human faces into perfect mirror symmetry, erasing every small natural asymmetry a person is born with. The faces did not become more attractive. In several cases, they became less attractive. Real human faces carry small, consistent asymmetries that are part of what makes a face read as human in the first place, not a flaw waiting to be corrected. So if human symmetry is this unreliable as a signal, the obvious question follows. Is there any species where symmetry genuinely does mean something, in a way researchers can actually measure and test? There is, and the evidence behind it is dramatically stronger than anything found in human faces. Picture a stag standing in a clearing at dusk, breath visible in the cold highland air, a rack of antlers rising above its head like something between a crown and a weapon. Red deer have carried structures like this for millions of years, regrowing them from nothing every single season. An adult stag can build a full set of antlers in a matter of months, pulling minerals and stored energy directly out of his own skeleton to construct bone that did not exist the year before. This is not decoration sitting quietly on top of the animal. It behaves more like an annual construction project, financed entirely out of the animal's own physical reserves. Long-running behavioral studies of red deer, going back decades, treated antlers as a genuine scientific puzzle rather than an obvious ornament. Why would evolution keep favoring a structure this expensive to build year after year for use that lasts only a few autumn weeks? The clearest answer researchers landed on is that antlers are first and foremost weapons. They get used directly in physical combat between rival males competing for access to females during the rut, and that combat has immediate, visible consequences for who wins and who does not. That much is the first layer. The deeper layer is where the story earns its place in this comparison. Antler quality in red deer is not fixed at birth. It responds to the animal's environment in ways that behave almost like a running, seasonal readout of the animal's own condition. In one controlled study, researchers found that male red deer housed near rival males grew noticeably larger antlers than males housed only with females and no competitive pressure at all. The stag's own body was adjusting its investment in this weapon based on the social stakes around it. That is not what a passive ornament does. That is what a costly, honest signal does. It scales in real time with the actual pressure an animal is under. There is a further layer beneath even that. Researchers studying antler condition have also looked at fluctuating asymmetry itself, meaning small, random differences between the left and right side of a single antler rack, the same kind of measurement scientists once hoped would work as cleanly in human faces. In red deer, that measurement has shown a real relationship to the animal's own condition and age. Stags closer to their physical prime, carrying more reserves and fewer developmental setbacks, tend to produce racks with less of this random left-right variation than younger or more depleted stags. Think of it the way an engineer might think about a load-bearing structure. A healthy, well-resourced body builds two sides that come out nearly matched, almost by accident, simply because nothing interrupted construction on either side. A stressed or under-resourced body is more likely to produce small errors, and those errors tend to show up unevenly left versus right, because growth on each side proceeds somewhat independently. That is the mechanism that makes antler symmetry a plausible signal in the first place. It is not that symmetry itself carries some mystical biological meaning. It is that symmetry is a side effect of a body that had enough resources to build without interruption, and asymmetry is a side effect of a body that did not. Apply that same logic back to a human face, and the story falls apart almost immediately. A human face finishes most of its major structural growth in adolescence, shaped by genetics, injury, chewing habits, and simple developmental chance, then stays largely fixed for decades afterward. There is no annual rebuild, no fresh season where the face gets reconstructed and retested the way an antler does. A red deer's antlers are remeasured by reality every single year. A human face is built once, then carried forward mostly unchanged, which is a large part of why using it as an ongoing signal of current health makes so little biological sense. Here is where the popular version of this story starts pulling away from what the research actually shows. Many claim that female red deer walk directly up to a stag, visually inspect his antlers for symmetry, and choose him on the spot, almost the same way culture imagines human attraction working through a glance and a judgment. The real evidence tells a more precise story and honestly a more interesting one. The clearest documented case of direct female choice in red deer does not run through antlers at all, it runs through sound. In playback experiments, researchers found that female red deer and estrus consistently preferred recorded roars simulating a larger caller. The females were responding to an acoustic cue tied to body size, not standing in a field visually auditing symmetry with their eyes. Researchers also tested a related claim directly, that estrus females actively move between harems specifically to find a preferred, presumably more impressive male. In a long-term field study, a substantial share of observed females did move between harems, some of them covering real distances, several kilometers in a number of cases. But when researchers looked closely at the pattern behind those movements, they found little support for the idea that this was females actively seeking out a preferred, higher-quality mate. The excursions were real. The tidy story about deliberate mate shopping by symmetry was not. So the myth here is not that red deer antlers matter biologically. They clearly do, and the evidence for that is strong. The myth is the specific claim that circulates constantly online, that female deer are running a visual symmetry inspection the way a person might scroll through profile photos on a dating app. What the research actually supports is narrower and in its own way more impressive. Antlers function as tested, costly weapons in real physical contests between males, and their size and condition correlate with fighting ability and social rank within that contest. Where direct female preference has been most clearly demonstrated, it runs through a roar revealing body size, not a visual symmetry check across a clearing. Correcting that myth actually strengthens the comparison to humans rather than weakening it. It shows what a genuinely rigorous, physically tested signal looks like: combat, real physical cost, consequences that show up within the very same season. Set that against a human face being judged in a photograph. softened by lighting, angled carefully, filtered before anyone even sees it, with no physical test behind the judgment at all, just a stranger's passing impression. Why did evolution build these two systems so differently? In red deer, the pressure was blunt and immediate. Males compete directly, often violently, for a limited number of mating opportunities each season, and losing a physical contest carries an instant reproductive cost that same year. A trait like antler size, reshaped annually by real fights with real winners and real losers, stayed under continuous, unforgiving pressure to remain an honest signal of current condition. There was nowhere for a weak antler to hide. Human evolution ran through a very different kind of pressure. Human mate selection never depended on one visible weapon tested annually in physical combat. It depended on a tangle of things at once, including cooperation, social alliance, resource access, and reputation built over years, with physical appearance sitting as only one input among many, and a fairly noisy one at that. A human face also has to do several unrelated jobs at the same time. It supports speech. It signals emotion in real time. It helps people recognize kin and strangers alike. None of that has anything to do with mate selection specifically, and that shared workload is a large part of why facial symmetry ended up such a weak, inconsistent biological signal in people. It was never built to function as a single-purpose readout the way an antler arguably is. There is also a difference in how these two signals get. A red deer's antlers get tested constantly, through direct physical contact, through actual pushing and locking of bone against bone in the middle of a contest that either side can lose. There is no faking a fight. If the antler cannot bear the load or the stag behind it lacks the stamina, that failure shows up immediately in front of every other deer watching. A human face has never been that way. Nobody physically tests a face for structural integrity before deciding whether to trust the impression it gives. Judgments happen instantly, based on a glance, a photograph, a few seconds of eye contact, with no mechanism forcing that judgment to correspond to anything real underneath it. That absence of a real-world test is precisely why a weak signal like facial symmetry was able to survive as a cultural belief for so long, even while the biological evidence behind it stayed thin. This is where modern life takes an already weak signal and makes it feel far stronger than it has ever actually been. An ancestral human rarely saw a clear reflection of their own face, and almost never saw a curated, filtered, artificially perfected version of another human face for direct comparison. Today, a person can scroll past hundreds of digitally optimized faces before finishing breakfast. Each one quietly reinforces an idea the underlying biology has never actually supported, that facial symmetry is something precise, worth checking, worth correcting, worth chasing. This is where the psychology becomes just as important as the biology. Research on social media use has found that upward appearance comparison, looking specifically at images perceived as more attractive than oneself, carries one of the clearest negative effects on body image compared to other kinds of online comparison researchers have studied. Related research on photo editing found that people who edit their own photos more heavily tend to report lower self-perceived attractiveness overall, and that self-perceived attractiveness tracks closely with self-esteem. The behavior meant to fix the insecurity often loops back and quietly feeds it instead. At the far edge of this pattern sits something clinical, not simply a habit that has gone slightly too far. In body disorder, appearance-related thoughts can occupy several hours of a person's day, with some research describing a range from roughly 3 to 8 hours daily, filled with checking, comparing, concealing, or seeking reassurance about a flaw that often is not visible to anyone else at all. That loop is not vanity. It behaves more like an error detection system turned relentlessly inward, one that keeps finding a problem because it has been trained to search for one, not because the problem is actually sitting there in the mirror. This same cultural landscape has shaped a handful of very specific, very modern beliefs, and it is worth testing them the same way this whole comparison has tested symmetry itself. One is the claim that a technique called mewing, essentially a form of tongue posture training, can meaningfully reshape an adult jawline over time. Dental and orthodontic experts have described the clinical evidence behind that specific claim as extremely thin, and have warned that attempting it incorrectly can create genuine problems with bite alignment and speech, rather than delivering the dramatic transformation promised online. An adult facial skeleton is not wet clay waiting patiently to be reshaped by posture alone. It behaves closer to a structure that finished most of its major building years earlier, with only limited surface remodeling still possible at all. A second modern belief involves collagen. It is true that skin loses collagen production with age, driven by aging skin cells and by real changes in the skin's underlying mechanical structure. That part of the story is well-established, unglamorous biology. What is far less settled is whether oral collagen supplements meaningfully reverse that visible aging process on their own. Some earlier studies reported modest cosmetic benefits after continued use, but a more recent, higher quality analysis found no clear clinical evidence supporting these supplements once study quality and funding sources were properly accounted for. The biology of decline here is real. The marketing built on top of that biology has, in places, run well ahead of what the evidence can actually support. None of this means appearance never matters, or that self-care is pointless noise. It means the honest, evidence-based version of self-care looks quite different from what appearance culture usually sells online. Basic skin protection from sun exposure has strong, well-established support behind it. Sleep, hydration, and general physical health all show up in how skin and complexion look over time, through ordinary, well-understood physiology, not through any single symmetry hack or overnight fix. None of these actions work the way a red deer's antler works, as a single dramatic seasonal signal judged all at once. They work more like slow, compounding maintenance, quietly protecting a structure that was mostly finished being built decades earlier. That distinction matters because expecting daily habits to deliver deer-level transformation sets a standard human biology was never designed to meet. And if appearance checking, comparing, or correcting starts consuming hours of a day rather than minutes, that pattern deserves to be named honestly and discussed with someone qualified to help, rather than quietly treated as just another habit worth optimizing further. It is worth being precise, too, about what this comparison can and cannot license. Red deer are not a blueprint for human self-improvement. Their biology answers questions shaped entirely by their own evolutionary pressures, not human ones, and antlers solve a problem that human faces were never asked to solve. Borrowing their story to justify a human appearance routine would be exactly the kind of overreach this whole topic warns against, taking one real, well-documented piece of evolutionary science and stretching it far past what it was ever shown to prove. So return for a moment to that number at the very beginning. 93%, roughly how consistently one side of a human face differs from the other, invisible in passing, obvious under a lens. Compare that to a stag on a Scottish hillside, whose antlers are judged not by a glance or a filtered photograph, but by an actual contest, fought and settled within a single season, with real physical stakes riding on the outcome. The deer's signal is tested by combat. The human face, most of the time, is tested by nothing at all beyond a passing look, a curated photograph, or an anxious few minutes in front of a mirror. Current evidence suggests facial symmetry in humans is a real and measurable perceptual preference, but a strikingly weak biological signal, nowhere near as rigorously proven as the costly, competition-tested traits carried by animals like the red deer. Somewhere between the raw biology and the online belief built on top of it, an entire culture arrived at a certainty the research itself has never actually offered. Understanding that gap, quietly and without judgment, may be the closest thing to real self-acceptance the science can honestly give back.